Shalom from Jerusalem. I'm Jonathan Hessen, and this is TV7 Israel's daily update. And in today's edition, we will focus, of course, on the Islamic Republic of Iran, plenty of developments there, as well as the situation in Iraq, in Lebanon, the energy market, where we currently with the latest developments in the Gulf and in Iran proper, and what actually triggered the escalation in which Israel decided to launch an attack against the South Pars gas field in Iran, something that the Iranians claim have triggered a lash out or a response against various Gulf Arab nations' energy infrastructure. Before all that, let's introduce our guest for today, to include all the way from the United States, Washington, D.C., as retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director at the National Security Council at the White House for the Middle East and North Africa, currently a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. It's a pleasure to have you.
Good to be with you.
Also joining us here in Israel is Major General in Reserve Yaakov Amidror, formerly an Israeli National Security Advisor, currently a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, as well as a senior fellow at the JINSA Center in Washington, D.C. It's good to have you also with us, General.
Happy to be with you.
It's a pleasure indeed. Well, let's start with the latest developments, actually with specific focus on deliberations in Washington. There was a national or the annual threat assessment published by the intelligence community there, as part of which there were various discussions on whether or not the threat emanating out of Iran was indeed imminent, or all kind of aspects related to that, with chief focus, of course, on the legitimacy of President Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury. In that context, Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to start with you. The definition of imminent when talking about intelligence on the strategic level is not necessarily what people think. It's not operational intelligence, which has different classifications of ongoing lifetime data flowing into the chambers of various squadrons or squads on the ground.
Well, that's right, Jonathan. Imminence is in the eye of the beholder, and the main beholder here is the commander-in-chief, the president. So he determined that the threat was one that needed to be acted upon very quickly. I think the best explanation of that, the rationale, was put out pretty authoritatively yesterday by the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, who explained what the administration meant by imminent. And also, he did a good job of laying out how the Iranian regime had been an active threat continually. So it's not as though they were sort of sitting there dormant and then were attacked out of the blue, that they were actually, that they'd been essentially, the deterrence against the Iranian regime had eroded. It needed to be reestablished. Also, he made a good point in highlighting the elements of the threat assessment that laid out what also Secretary Rubio had previously discussed, which is that what the Iranian regime was trying to do in 2026 was to vastly expand its ballistic missile arsenal so as to make themselves impregnable as they then restarted their nuclear program, ramped up their nuclear program to recover from the strike against them last summer. And that was something. So in other words, with each passing week, with each passing month, and Secretary Rubio pointed out that the estimate was the Iranian regime was able to produce an additional 100 or so ballistic missiles a month, so that by the time you get to the end of 2026 and on into 2027, that the ballistic missile threat would be one that would be unmanageable for the scope of our missile defense, not just us, but allies such as Israel and the Gulf partners, and so on. And so that was a threat that was going to get worse and worse as time went on, until if you waited on the political calendar in the United States, which is what I think some people wanted to do. Let's wait until after the midterms and so on. There were some voices saying that if we're going to take action against the Iranian regime, that if you waited that long, the window of opportunity would be closed, and it would be too difficult, dangerous a problem.
Well, the discourse at the time was indeed, as you mentioned, since the launch of Operation Rising Lion on June 13th, up until the moment of the launch of Operation Roaring Lion or Epic Fury on the 28th of February, did indicate quite clearly that the Iranians were at the weakest stage since it became clear that their malign intentions were to achieve nuclear weapon capabilities and to ensure that they want to also develop a intercontinental ballistic missile with their space program, never reaching the moon naturally, but establishing a 2 or even a 3-stage ballistic missile capable of reaching continental United States. That is not for the purpose of establishing or advancing civilian necessities, but rather posing a direct threat to the United States, alongside also the various enrichment, purely enriched materials of more than 60% or up to 60%. There are various discussions on that. That was still buried underground, and the Iranians could at some point dig it out and utilize it for their malign aspirations. Now, General Amidror, I'd like you to hear your take on this, because Israel obviously provided its own assessments, and there is an Israeli interest to degrade the Ayatollah regime's threat of annihilation against the state of Israel, which was very clear. They're open about it, and it's also part of their religious ideology. Now, within that context, while Israel was a factor, it was not the main trigger that brought about President Trump's decision to launch Operation Epic Fury, since he was clear-eyed about the Iranian threat from years ago.
Look, I never understood the whole idea of imminent threat. Assuming that someone wants to kill you in your house and you get a good information that he is approaching your door, and someone will tell you, guy, before he's opening the door, it's not imminent. He's behind the door, so you cannot kill him outside your home. You have to wait till he will come in. Then if he'll come in, it's imminent and you can do whatever. No, it's stupid. If you know that someone is preparing what is needed to destroy, you saw this guy killing 30,000 people of his own citizens. And you said, it's not imminent. He didn't kill yet, I don't know, 100,000. You have to wait till we'll have enough uranium for not for 5 bombs, but for 10 bombs, then it will be imminent, or it will be 90%, then it will be imminent. It sounds unbelievable stupid, all this argument. It was clear that the Iranians are preparing destroying Israel. It was clear that the president called the opposition to get out to the street, and the Iranians killed more than 30,000 people of them. The combination of the feeling in Israel that it might be too late if we don't act, and the fact that the president took kind of a commitment to the Iranian people, made the combination that brought both America and Israel into the operation. People who push whom. President Trump pushed Prime Minister Netanyahu. Prime Minister Netanyahu pushed President Trump, and no one think about the option that they didn't have to push each other. They came to the conclusion that this is the best time to do it. Iran is still very weak because of the success of Israel in June. The Iranians are going to resume their nuclear project. It could be seen in the intelligence. The Iranians are determined to produce thousands of missiles that will be part of their ability to attack all the countries around the Middle East. And you see what happened during the war. They attacked so many countries, leave alone Israel aside. It is the Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. I mean, it was clear that it is their preparations and the commitment of the president to the opposition in Iran. And both of them, they met together and say, why shouldn't we do it now? This is the best time.
Well, of course, Iraq and even Oman, there was mediating on behalf of the Iranians,
Oman,
was struck.
Iraq.
It's and we will touch shortly about those attacks that also have their implications on the global oil market, on the fertilizer market, and many other aspects that have to do with the implications of this war. But I'd like to turn to you, Colonel Rayburn. Obviously, intelligence is an art. It's not a data-driven, well, it's a data-driven art rather than a science, which is something that we always need to take into account, again, on the strategic level. But looking more deliberately on the way Iran is currently posturing itself against the United States and Israel, it is utilizing a Chinese doctrine, actually, the A2AD, namely anti-access aerial denial type of doctrine, a strategy that aims to bring about a very clear equation that the Chinese are now observing, since it's their strategy. Also, it's a Russian strategy at that. And they're not being very successful. There's much to learn here, both for the United States as well as for the adversaries in this context, saying, okay, we might be approaching this whole situation wrongly.
Well, the Iranians, I do think you're right. I think the Iranians had hoped to execute an A2AD doctrine. They'd hoped to be able to deny their airspace and their waters to enemy forces, but they didn't invest. They didn't have a strategic doctrine to back it up, and they didn't invest in the kind of capabilities that would be required to enforce that over time. They spent under Ali Khamenei. I think, you know, there will be books written, I think, about the foreign policy and national security strategy of Ali Khamenei. I think what we're seeing is the culmination of his misguided, crazy theory of Iran's national security policy, which had them invest for more than 3 decades overwhelmingly in asymmetric capabilities while ignoring their conventional forces, their conventional capabilities. So they find themselves at the end, they're facing 2 very powerful air forces without an air force of their own, without air defense forces of their own. They're facing a vast navy without a navy of their own, really, to speak of. They don't really have a ground force either. So they have ignored the kind of conventional forces and capabilities that you would need to have to defend your own territory that large. They always assumed, I've talked about this with you before, they've assumed for more than 30 years that they could always be on offense, they could always use proxies, they could always deter through asymmetric means and never have their bluff called, never have to actually defend their home territory or their capital. And that myth has been punctured, and they don't have anything to fight back with. So I think militarily speaking, this is a contest that's already, its outcome is already a foregone conclusion. It's just a matter of how painful and how long it takes to get to that foregone conclusion. What's harder to judge beyond that is what will be the political end game in Iran. But there's likely to be a very different one there too as well.
Absolutely. Well, with the decapitation, the last of which was the Minister of Intelligence, I mean, it is devastating to this regime that has lost so many of its leaders. I mean, the regime is pretty much obliterated, in the words of President Trump. But again, there remain at least, I think, 7 or 8 who were defined as senior, a couple of others in lower ranks that have temporarily replaced their predecessors. And it seems like as long as this progresses, their state of affairs on being able to govern and control whatever is left is going to be very, very interesting to watch. But General, I'd like to touch on the AD within the equation, since there is an area denial, namely the Strait of Hormuz. There are implications to it that are obviously putting strain on the global economy, be it on the energy pricing, the export of at least 2/3 of Gulf countries' energy products, and also fertilizers and various components for chips and other advanced technologies that usually transit through the strategic strait, alongside hundreds of various attacks that were conducted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps against energy infrastructure in all of the countries you mentioned earlier, something that obviously had to be responded to. And it seems like the messaging that Israel ultimately did in attacking South Pars was, Iran, if you don't stop attacking the energy infrastructure of the Gulf countries, you're vulnerable.
It's almost impossible to make the calculation that they are doing in Tehran. It never was easy. And now with disappearing of many decision makers, and we don't know how the system works, all those who had been nominated to substitute those who went to meet the virgins in the next world. I don't know what is their calculation. And at the end of the day, we have to take into consideration that maybe we don't understand them, and they will go the whole way and will be ready to take the risk of being in a situation in which Israel and America destroy their facilities. But if they make enough damage in between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, the Emirates, very important, and so on, the pressure on the Americans will be huge. And because we don't know how to calculate it, and how to assess how much risk they are ready to take and what risk they are ready to take, we have to ask ourselves the question from other way of thinking. How far we are ready to take risks to be sure that at the end of the war, Iran will be weak enough. And I'm not sure that we did that assessment, how far we are ready to go. With Israel, it's very easy because it is about our existence. We are ready to take very high risks. In America, it's not about the existence or the distance of the United States of America. It's about America as the superpower, and America which want to prevent future attacks by the Iranians that slowly having the ability to launch missiles into Europe and then probably to America if it will not be stopped. But it's a very problematic calculation because the alternative is to give up. And I think giving up now to Iran will be a signal to China, Russia, all the other despotic systems in the Middle East and outside the Middle East. It will be so bad to the world and to America that I think that the Americans understand it. What they will do, I don't know. I'm not giving advice to the Americans. I don't like to give advice to the Americans. Enough people in America that can make the calculation better than me.
Well, for that we have Colonel Rayburn. Joel, let's talk escalation dominance for a moment in the conventional sense. Where does the latter end?
Well, first of all, let me address the point that General Amidror raised, which is what price is let's say even what price is President Trump and his administration willing to pay? I mean, they're not really paying much of a price right now. I mean, you can say energy prices are up, but they're not up crazily. I remember a time during during the surge in the Iraq War where oil was up over $150 a barrel, and that was quite expensive. Right now, it's hovering. The U.S. oil, West Texas oil, is under $100 a barrel. Brent oil is around 110, fluctuating there. So I think that's not prohibitive. Politically speaking, the president has, according to recent polling, he has the support of more than 90% of his base, especially the MAGA part of his base. And even on the question of ground troops, Republicans responding to polls are about split 50-50, which I think surprised many people. So he's not under particular political pressure. He's not under unrelenting energy pressure. There could be the expenditure. Now they're talking about going back to Congress for a $200 billion supplemental for the Pentagon in order to support the operations. That's a pretty big price tag, but put it in perspective, it's nothing like the cost of the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War, I think President Trump could say. So I don't think he's under terribly intense pressure. Also, the U.S. has taken exactly 6 casualties to hostile fire in this war, which is pretty astonishing, I think. If you think about it, I mean, it's quite this is not an even fight. It's a military mismatch, I think, on the order of the British troops defeating the Sudanese at Omdurman in 1896. That's the disparity. Okay, so I haven't answered your specific question about escalation dominance, but I've taken enough time to let me end it there, so the general can also pitch in.
Well, I still want briefly, if you may, on the escalation dominance, and then General Amidror will get the final 3 minutes after that.
Well, I'll just quickly say, look, what the Iranian regime is defenseless. It's strategically defenseless. It's almost operationally defenseless right now. I mean, it doesn't have the ability to fight back except with some meager ballistic missiles. It's trying to fire off more ballistic missiles, but it's not really doing strategic damage. It's got a lot of drones, but not enough to tip a strategic balance, and not really doing that much damage. In Iraq, it's doing a little bit of damage, I think worse than elsewhere. So it doesn't have any, it's not able to deter much. The question of the Strait is still unresolved, but I think it'll get resolved. I think CENTCOM's working on that very, very intensely. And we learned this morning from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that CENTCOM has A-10s and has Apache gunships actually working around the Strait in order to destroy the fast attack craft, the little harassing boats that the Iranian, which is just about those are the last naval craft that the Iranians have left. We also heard from Secretary Hegseth this morning that it looks like none of the 11 pre-existing Iranian submarines are still in action. So they don't have much. So escalation dominance, for a defenseless regime, escalation dominance is all on our side. No matter how, they can't go up the escalation ladder very, very far.
So here it comes down to what America decides, and that is the important point to put. The ladder stops for the Iranians at the point where their launchers are pretty much eliminated. And it seems like as time progresses more, every type of launcher utilized, there is a certain gap of a couple of minutes in which those are being targeted. The terrain sometimes is difficult, but nonetheless, it's being worked around. General Amidror, we don't have very much time left, but let's touch for a moment on Lebanon. Colonel Rayburn mentioned that in Iraq, the fighting is intensive. In Lebanon, there is a high-intensity conflict currently raging, but it seems like there are certain achievements being made. What can you tell us about that? Roughly 2 minutes for this.
Okay, the IDF is in a defensive posture. We didn't move yet to the offensive stage. What we are doing now is to push Hezbollah to the north, to eliminate the ability of Hezbollah to launch ground operation against any Israeli community near the border, to push Hezbollah capability to launch anti-tank missiles into civilian communities as they did before the ceasefire. So we have to move at least 10 kilometers from the border to take control on the areas which has the height that control the area, to deny it from Hezbollah, so Hezbollah cannot use its Kornet anti-tank missiles directly against the civilian communities. And in a way, the IDF is becoming the buffer and the barrier between Hezbollah, which sends some forces to the south, and the communities. Hezbollah still has the ability to launch missiles and rockets into Israel, and that's what they did. What they have is probably less than 25% of what they had before the war, but 25% out for 100,000 is a huge number. But it is still the defensive stage. It's very important to understand. People are saying, okay, what happened? Why don't you do that and do that? We are concentrating all our efforts in the main front, Iran. And we don't want to take capabilities that might be used in Iran to Lebanon. The day that we will finish in Iran, we will move and we will give the Lebanese government a choice. Either you are disarming Hezbollah, which will be weaker because we are attacking all the time. Part of the defensive system, we are taking all the targets that can be identified and destroy them. And all the IDF will do it. And we are preparing it, our plans, but the decision was not taken yet, and the reason is Iran.
I had a conversation with a Lebanese friend, and he was telling me about how he and his friends noticed that the strikes are a lot more reserved than the previous round during the September campaign that ultimately brought about the capitulation of Hezbollah by the 27th of November in 2024. And I told him, well, the IDF hasn't started yet. And
Yep.
that kind of rung in. But unfortunately, this is all the time that we have.
It's good for Israel if Naim Qassem will remain there.
True. I think he's safe for all the good reasons. But anyways, I'd like to thank Colonel Rayburn and General Amidror for all of your insights today. And I'd like to thank you at home as well. Until our next edition. From here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
For more of TV7 Israel's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com. Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.